The energy of the bombs would likely cause many large fires. This, in turn, would result in a lot of smoke, and with thousands of fires across the entire United States.
Oh, are they seriously going for the tried-old nuclear winter argument? Today we're going to be looking at another one of Film Theory's videos. Specifically, the Fallout nukes are a lie. Portal reference? For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering and operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this one out.
The world of Fallout is a lie. The irradiated desert wasteland full of people struggling to survive isn't what would happen if the bombs we see in the Fallout show dropped in the real world. But the reality is...
I mean, that's pretty obvious, creating a bunch of mutant creatures, deformities, monsters, ghouls. No. Even with a ridiculous amount of surface detonations, you're just looking at mass death. Not a monster show.
So much worse. Strap on your Pip Boys, loyal theorists, as we explore the real fallout of this great war. Hello, Internet! Welcome to Film Theory, the show that doesn't want to set the world on fire, it just wants to start a flame in your heart. So, believe it or not, but for as much as I love movies, I am also a lifelong gamer. I did get my start editing for Game Theory, after all, and the games I love the most? RPGs like Fallout. No joke, I
liked Fallout as well. I like Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. Tried Fallout 4, could not get into it. I think it's because it's more of a shooter than an RPG.
I had a cat named after the game director at Fallout's developer, Bethesda. R.I.P. Todd Howard, you were a good cat. If you don't know, Fallout takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where nuclear war has destroyed most of human civilization. The few survivors have banded together in makeshift cities and raider gangs, pillaging the wasteland or inside vaults designed to keep their residents safe.
Now that right there is Vault 4's 3-foot thick lead casing, strong enough to keep out the rads.
3 foot thick lead, that's a lot. Is it strong enough to keep out radiation? Yeah, under most conditions. 8 inches of lead will attenuate most gamma radiation, so that really is plenty. Though, that's not to say you couldn't, if you set off a nuclear weapon right next to it, no. But that's true with any sort of protective structure, armor, anything like that.
And the reds.
And all of that is wrapped in a pretty bow of a retro-future aesthetic, dark humor, and over-the-top violence. This is one franchise that does not pull its punches. So why are we talking about this game franchise on Film Theory today? Well, I was both excited and terrified to hear that they were adapting the series into a television show over on Amazon Prime. Would it live up to the franchise's highest heights, or be broken and janky? Happy to say that the Fallout show is more Last of Us than Halo, a faithful adaptation that features all of the same brutal comedy and social commentary that makes Fallout so special.
Listen to me. Hollywood is the past. Forget Hollywood. The future, my friend, is products. You're a product, I'm a product. The end of the world is a product.
All while using art directly out of the games and being a pretty dang good TV show on top of it. I have to say, I did get some pretty good feelings on this one when they proudly proclaimed to be from the studio who brought us free 2-day shipping. It just feels so Fallout.
That's pretty funny.
Oh my gosh, Lee. Lee, are you stealing another one of my franchises?
No. Get out of here, Tom. This one's mine. I was there when Fisto told me to assume the position, when there were cars falling out of the sky in Fallout 4. I've spent more time modding these games than some people have spent playing them, Tom. Come back and get mad when I steal Minecraft or something, I don't know. Regardless, while most of the Fallout show takes place a full 2 centuries after the end of the world, the opening scene decides to do something a little bit different, instead starting the day the bombs fell. Here, one of our protagonists, Cooper Howard, sees the blasts ignite all across the Los Angeles skyline. Desperate.
All right, those blasts right there, I'm just seeing like little puff plumes. I'm not seeing any shockwaves or any of the widespread destruction. Either those are very weak nuclear weapons, or they're clearly going for the more cartoony aesthetic that you see the games are in, which would probably makes sense. Realistic? No, but faithful to the games, and I think that's what most people are judging the success on the show by. Is it faithful to the games that they played? Which, totally understand.
To get to safety, Cooper and his daughter head for the Hollywood Hills. It's a chilling scene. Los Angeles is more or less wiped off the face of the map. Neighbors and friends turn on one another. Everyone is running for their lives. But of course, I wouldn't be a very good theorist
All in 1950s-ish garb, because despite this being set in the 2070s.
if scenes like this didn't also trigger my scientific curiosity. After all, Cooper and his daughter are awfully close to some of these explosions, and it made me think, could they
If it was realistic, no, the shockwave would get them. If not the thermal pulse, but you're not really seeing any of that in the actual show. But you don't see that in the game either. Nah, they'd have third-degree burns, and what's left of them would be shattered by the shockwave. The shockwave would be the most deadly part at this particular distance, depending on the yield of the weapon, but just by eyeballing it, I'd say the shockwave would take them out before anything else.
even survive this? Would Cooper have even had the opportunity to make it past this day and link up with the other characters in the show? I just had to dig into it, and after running the numbers, well, the answer shocked me, and it's gonna blow this show wide open. See, loyal theorists, if you look at this scene, you'll find that the world that this show, that the entire Fallout franchise sets up, is a lie. More likely than not, none of these characters in the opening scene would have made it, Cooper included, and few of the future characters would have even had the opportunity to be born. The fallout of Fallout would have been much worse than even this series could have imagined. So step into your power armor, friends. We're headed into the wasteland to find out why.
Let's see.
To start, let's all catch ourselves up on what we're talking about here. First off, the show is actually set in the same canon as the games, which itself is a challenge since most of the games all have multiple endings, but that's a headache for another day. Regardless, the show also has the distinction of being amongst some of the earliest and the latest content we see in the Fallout timeline. Yeah, though the main events of the show take place in
You just see it as alternate timelines, though. Reminds me of some episodes of Star Trek. You can just see it as branching paths. We're kind of like the Star Wars fan base, which the separation of Legends and Disney canon. I've never looked too into that. Besides, any real fan will just stick their head canon in there anyway, so...
296, around 9 years after the events of Fallout 4, there are numerous flashbacks that take place in or before 2077 and the Great War that destroyed the world. And though this isn't the first time we've seen the bombs drop in the franchise, it is the best look at the devastating event that the series has offered to date. Because of that, we can now do all sorts of cool stuff, like figure out exactly how bad these bombs would have been for the world, and specifically for Cooper here. Let's start out by figuring out exactly where the bombs dropped in this scene. This part of the show takes place in Los Angeles, and we get a nice aerial shot as 3 nukes are detonated over the city. This right here gives us all of the info we need to pinpoint these explosions.
They're also being detonated on the surface. That's not a very efficient way to destroy a city, realistically, because a lot of the energy is just going to go into the ground, whereas you'd have an expanding sphere for an airburst detonation that's going to cause way more damage to cities. However, surface detonations are going to be more likely to destroy even a bit of underground structures that are in the immediate blast zone and cause a lot more surface contamination. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my limited understanding of the Fallout universe is it involves a lot more nuclear weapons that we ever have available today, doing a bunch of surface detonations. Not necessarily more powerful nuclear weapons. In fact, a lot of them may be less powerful, like what you see here, but doing a lot of damage to the surface, which is why the radiation levels are so high. That's not an implausible explanation, apart from the mutations and monsters.
Thanks to this building. That there in the corner of this shot is the Griffith Observatory, a famous landmark that you may recognize from everything from Terminator to La La Land to Grand Theft Auto 5.
Crashing a blip into it.
Davey!
Using this, we can hop on Google Earth and line it up with the show, letting us know that we're here somewhere up in the mountains north of Hollywood. You may also notice that unlike the show, there aren't any skyscrapers here in this part of LA in the real world. But this would still make sense given that this portion of the Fallout timeline takes place a full 50 years after the present day, and that the world of Fallout diverged from our own shortly after World War II.
Then you got that whole retro-futuristic vibe, a whole bunch of Art Deco Chrysler building looking structures everywhere in every major city, just extrapolated out. And we're not really just extrapolating 50 years out, we're extrapolating 120 years out, because the culture is really set in the 1950s.
We can forgive this little bit of artistic license taken with the LA skyline. Regardless, using this information, we can figure out roughly where the epicenter of these 3 explosions are. The one closest to Cooper is just southeast of the observatory, putting ground zero right about here in Hollywood. The second explosion is even further southeast, putting it smack dab in downtown LA. And the third explosion off in the distance there is quite a bit further south. I'd estimate that this bomb was dropped straight out of Compton. Finally, the very first bomb that sends Cooper headed for the hills is a bit tougher to identify. But because we can see the edge of it in this aerial shot over on the right, we can use that to estimate that it would be roughly here, just south of Koreatown. Admittedly, that is a bit of a guess based.
It's a lot of weapons to use on one city, but again, they're smaller. I'm not sure what the nuclear warfare doctrine is in this Fallout universe. I really don't know. Also, were they missiles? Were they MIRV warheads from an ICBM? Were they ground nukes like infiltrators, terrorists with suitcase nukes? I don't actually know. But it's just so weird to me that they're surface detonations. That almost implies it was like a suitcase nuke or something. Because we didn't see a rocket, hit or anything like that.
Based on our limited data, and it may be a few blocks in either direction, but trust me, it won't actually end up mattering that much in the end. Okay, now that we've identified where the nukes went off, we need to figure out exactly how high they were in the air when they exploded. But
they look like
why would they be exploding in the air? Well, we've gone into great detail about this in previous videos, but the long and short of it, detonating an explosive device in the air actually provides far more destructive power versus when it explodes on the ground. This concept is known as an air burst, and it's actually how the atomic bombs deployed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated in World War II. And this mostly tracks with what we see here in Fallout. If you go through this shot here frame by frame, though it's a bit difficult to make out, we can see that the center of the flash, and therefore the explosion, is just over the top of the buildings here in Hollywood.
Wow. I wouldn't have picked that up. It looked like it just poofed up from the bottom, but yeah. One thing to keep in mind about nuclear weapons is they're very fast. The eye can't really pick it up. Even this frame by frame, so again, going on a more realistic note, the reaction is ancient history at this point. There's a unit of measure for how fast nuclear reactions are called the shake. A shake is 100 nanoseconds. So as an observer looking here, by the time the beam of light reaches your eyeball, let alone in being interpreted by your brain to comprehend what even just took place, the reaction was ancient history. Because in just a couple of shakes or even less, the fuel already burned itself out and is then the fission reaction or fusion reaction, in the case if it's a thermonuclear bomb, already happened and the energy is about to be released. It's really cool how fast nuclear reactions are. But props to them for pausing, because I wouldn't have noticed that.
Unfortunately, like we just explained, these buildings aren't actually real, so we can't use them to get an exact measurement of this height. So what we're gonna do instead is use the tallest building currently in Los Angeles, the Wilshire Grand Center, as a benchmark. This building stands at 1,100 feet or 335 meters tall, which sounds reasonable for an airburst like this. But again, as we will soon see, going a dozen meters up or down isn't gonna change the end result that much.
Normally I think of 500 meters, but it kind of depends on the yield that we're talking. I'm thinking, on the order of a few hundred kilotons, but it really depends.
Finally, the last piece of the puzzle we need here is just how powerful these bombs are. The yield or power of bombs this big is measured in terms of just how much TNT it would take to get the same amount of power. So for context,
So key term about power, yield, energy, I know this is a bit of a nitpick, but power, you're looking at energy per unit time. You're going to have ridiculously high power numbers because you're dividing by a very small number. Remember when I had said shake? So power is doesn't really mean anything. It's a bit like a handheld laser tattoo remover can technically have a power of megawatts because those pulses are so short, the power is irrelevant. But in terms of what it actually does to your skin, you're not talking about, you're not talking about like a power plant concentrating its energy into your skin or anything like that. So really its yield or energy is the performance metric that you're looking at. Because power can get a little weird.
Bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of 15 kilotons, or 15,000 tons of TNT. But how big are these bombs in Fallout? Thankfully, this is where the fact that the games in the show take place in the same universe comes in clutch. See, packaged with every copy of the original Fallout 1 was the Vault Dweller's Survival Guide. Basically, it was the player's manual, but written from the point of view of the in-universe Vault tech. Man, I miss when games came with cool inserts like this in the box. Regardless, the Survival Guide explains that, quote, "The yield of a modern strategic warhead is, with few exceptions, now typically in the range of 200 to 750 kilotons."
And megaton's largely been retired. I mean, that's largely true in real life. I mean, there's a handful of weapons on the order of megatons, like a B-83 is over a megaton. But yeah, we're talking 200, 400 kilotons in real life. 750 is a bit of an interesting number, but again, this is within the Fallout universe, so I mean, yeah, take that as canon.
It's actually quite a bit smaller than the biggest bombs the US has today, which sit at around 1.2 megatons or 1,200 kilotons of TNT. But
it's true, but again, those are the biggest ones. Those aren't necessarily the most common nuclear weapons there are. So yeah, in fact, the B-83, I want to say is the B-83 is the one that's about 1.2 megatons.
Using the info from the Survival Guide, we're going to say that the three smaller explosions we see are towards the bottom of that range, around 200 kilotons in size, while the big bomb that started the whole sequence is at the top of that scale, approximately 750 kilotons. With bombs like that, you can see why they say that war never changes. All of that info, where the bombs fell, how high they were, and how big they were, we can plug all of that into this online tool Nuke Map to...
Those bombs just kind of, in the clips they showed, just look like little plumes. So just looking at how big the poof was doesn't tell you the whole story. Going by what's written down in a technical manual versus what you actually see on screen is different. And I've seen that before and when other people have analyzed sci-fi. There's a couple of different schools of thought, but that's one way to do it. I mean, here we're just talking about analyzing a work of fiction, so going with the technical manual is one thing. The important thing is to at least be consistent. The problem is a lot of the people that make these shows aren't always consistent, because my experience has been a writer doesn't necessarily calculate the power scaling of each individual weapon or each individual superpower in the case of comparing if, say, Superman is stronger than Goku, for instance. So there's a good bit of ambiguity there left when looking at a piece of fiction like that.
Simulate exactly how much devastation these bombs would wreak across the city of Angel.
Okay, that nuke map thing is actually fairly accurate. I've referenced that before in some of my videos in the past. So if they use this, then that should be a pretty reasonable source.
And everyone's dead.
Those circles don't mean everyone is actually dead. So here's a 750 kiloton air burst using the exact same nuke map over central LA. The inner circle, orange circle, is the fireball. Everyone in there is dead. The gray circle is the moderate blast radius. Most structures, residential, standard buildings are going to be destroyed. The outer orange circle is the thermal pulse radius, so everything there is on fire. And the outer circle is light damage. We're talking things like broken glass. It's going to knock people down, that sort of thing. As far as radiation damage, you can see the deadly zone is the green circle. That's 500 millirem. Possible to survive with medical treatment, but you're in a nuclear blast zone. You're not going to get medical treatment. The orange ones, you're going to be affected, but it's not necessarily going to be lethal or even that severe, and is highly dependent on which way the wind is blowing.
See what I meant earlier when I said a few meters here or there wasn't ultimately going to matter? Yeah, but regardless of where the Griffith Observatory or the Hollywood sign, or basically anywhere in the greater Los Angeles area, he'd be dead long before he knew what hit him, and longer before he got into the ghoulish desperado we see later in the story.
Well, that may be somewhat consistent with the way they are in the games, because nuclear weapons do seem oddly underpowered in terms of destructive force, but radiation is more of a mutagenic force and possibly a magical force in the games. Consistent with reality, no, but with the games, maybe. I remember in Fallout 3, a nuke was detonated in Megaton, and one of the main quest-giving characters just turned into a ghoul, largely due to the power of plot armor and keeping that quest available.
could go into painful detail about exactly what from these explosions would be killing Cooper and his daughter, but honestly, we've talked about the effects of these sorts of nuclear explosions a lot in the past.
Radiation, they would actually be far enough away from the immediate radiation. Now, it's possible they could get blanketed with the fallout plume if the wind happens to be going that direction, but they'll be long dead by the time the fallout hits them.
And just look at this map.
So those big scary contours are not immediate death. You could escape by getting into a shelter to avoid the fallout, because you have to be physically hit with the plumes. And the inside, 1,000 rads per hour. Next one is 100 rads per hour. And then 10 and 1 rads per hour. It's not going to kill you very quickly compared to the other effects of the weapon. They need to do a better job explaining what the strokes mean. While I agree that they're going to be dead, they're overstating what these areas mean. These places aren't wiped off the face of the earth. Now, not to say those sources of fallout are insignificant. That is a very high dose of radiation, but it isn't going to kill instantly, and you can make your way to a shelter. But it's almost like for this video, they just did a cursory look at what Nuke Map was without looking at what all the shaded colors actually meant.
This range from these explosions, Cooper would have been hit by an overpressure blast wave of just around 4.81 psi. That's enough to break glass and just about enough to burst your eardrum, if he even survived that long for the shockwave to hit. See, the radiant heat from the explosions would have hit him
Thermal
first,
pulse.
traveling at the speed of light, cooking every square inch of his body. Thermal dosages are typically measured in calories per square centimeter, and just so you have a frame of reference, third-degree burns set in at around 8 calories per square centimeter. The first and largest bomb in Koreatown here in Fallout would have been hitting Cooper and everyone else at that birthday party with 12.5 calories per square centimeter, which would be almost certainly lethal, while the closest bomb in Hollywood would have followed shortly with another 26.3 calories per square centimeter. They'd basically be instantly cooked by these bombs. And
That's true. Obviously, light does travel faster than sound, so effectively he's getting hit by both. And then when the radiation sets, if it happens to be in his direction. So yeah, he'll be killed 3 different ways.
even if Cooper and the rest were somehow able to survive all of that, the ionizing radiation released by the blasts would be getting to them in no time. In just an hour in this post-nuclear LA, Cooper would have been exposed to 1,720 rims, or rads, of radiation, enough to incapacitate you in 5 minutes and kill you within days.
So the difference between rims and rads, rad is absorbed dose. Think energy per unit mass, so joules per kilogram. And REMS is that multiplied by a quality factor with the effect that has on the human body. If it's 100% gamma, which is best case scenario, then a rad and a REM are basically the same thing, which is probably a safe bet here. This is something you take into consideration if you get hit with, say, neutron bomb, then there can be anywhere from a 5 to 20 times multiplier if you're in an active neutron field. But at this distance, all of the neutrons were released at the epicenter of the reaction, so he wouldn't really be affected by them at this point. So yeah, 1720 rads, 1720 REMs, same difference.
Again, for a frame of reference, even in the games like Fallout 4, just 1,000 rads is enough to cause your player character to keel over and die on the spot.
That's actually not a bad thing for a gameplay mechanic. No, it won't kill you instantly, but you're definitely gonna die. At 400 to 600 rads, you're probably gonna die, even with medical intervention, and it's possible to die at less than that. It's also possible to survive it, but yeah, 1,000 death is pretty much certain at this point. In 400 to 600, you're what's known as an LD 50-60, that's 50% of the population dead within 60 days.
Clearly, given what we know in Fallout lore and what we see here in the Fallout TV show, Cooper and everyone else we see in this opening scene just being so close to these 200 or 750 kiloton bombs would kill them instantly, rupturing their organs, vaporizing their skin, and irradiating their body.
Yeah, one of those is more than enough to do it.
And normally, I'd be content to leave things here. That's a fun revelation about this show, putting this really cool scene in a new light using a combination of science and lore. This main character is dead, and we can prove it. Classic theorist stuff. But something about this whole thing was still bothering me. As I was watching the show and seeing these explosions, I couldn't help but think that they looked a little, well, small. I've done a surprising
Same, they do. It's a classic example of a difference between what the tech manuals say and what you actually see on screen.
amount of research about nuclear explosions during my time here at Theorist, and though I'm no nuclear physicist, I do know
I'm not a physicist, but I'm an engineer.
that these bombs are supposed to be massive. Like, stretch up into the atmosphere massive.
They do, though Fallout nukes aren't exactly the most realistic, as if you've played the games.
Not that. They're big, don't get me wrong, but they're not as large as they should be. So I decided to dive a little deeper into the data and found an interesting feature over on NukeMap. See, once you detonate the bombs in the tool, you can export that data to Google Earth and see the scale of the mushroom clouds. Bombs in the tool, you can export that data to Google Earth and see the scale of the mushroom clouds in all of their glory. But when I did this for the
far as
200
the height.
and 750 kiloton nukes, this is what I got. If this looks like a confusing image to you, fair, it was to me too. It wasn't until I zoomed out that I realized that what we're seeing here,
The actual
all of that
plumes.
black blob taking up so much of the image, that is the mushroom cloud we should be seeing if these nukes had a yield as powerful as Fallout lore says. Essentially, as he rides
Well, it's possible these particular nukes didn't. These could have been low-level tactical nukes in the actual TV show. Or the TV show has a different branching path from the lore.
his horse on by the Griffith Observatory, Cooper would basically be inside of the mushroom cloud of the bomb detonated in Hollywood. And the height of these clouds should be as tall as 18 kilometers. There is simply no way that these bombs we see here in the show are as powerful as the Vault Dweller's survival guide told us. But we can figure out how strong they are based on what we see. Yeah, after playing around with NukeMap a little bit more, I was able to create this, which is far more true to size of the clouds we see in the show. You want to take a wild guess at how powerful these bombs are? They're not 100
Couple
kilotons.
kilotons.
They're not even 10 kilotons. In fact, the smaller bombs here have a yield of just 100 tons. 150th the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And
Now that's consistent in Fallout. You see like the shoulder launch nuke cannon, so that's kind of goes back to what I was wondering earlier. It kind of looked like a surface detonation with smaller weapons.
the bigger bomb detonated in the show here in Koreatown ended up just a little bit bigger, but even still, it was just a single kiloton of TNT. On the scale of nuclear explosions that we've seen in the media and in the real world, that is insanely small.
Small, but it does have its uses as a tactical nuke.
These explosions are still going to be devastating. The city would be in rough shape, no two ways about it. But for the vast majority of Los Angelinos, they'd have plenty of time to hop in their cars or on their horses to escape. In fact,
That's
not
possible.
only would Cooper totally survive this sort of blast, but he'd likely experience no negative side effects whatsoever if he stayed clear of the fallout headed downwind. And what's
I'm glad for this, and this is kind of refreshing compared to some other film theory videos I've looked at in the past, that they're actually exploring both sides. There's both what you see on screen versus what it is theoretically within the fictional universe. That's actually kind of cool because these, as you can see, those are very different realities that you're seeing.
more, this isn't even a case of these explosions being significantly smaller than the other ones we've seen throughout the Fallout
Yeah, because these explosions, like it's possible for non-nuclear explosions to be that large, and also even generate mushroom clouds, because that's really just a function of buoyancy rather than anything nuclear. Unlike what you see in some of the games of a car exploding in this cute teeny tiny mushroom cloud.
franchise. Both the bomb in Fallout 3's Megaton quest and the explosion from Fallout 4's prologue are in line with the ones we see here in the Fallout TV show. So, does that mean that these super powerful, civilization-ending nuclear explosions might not have been as world-shatteringly powerful as we see from various bits of Fallout media? That the world maybe shouldn't have been as devastated as we see in the games and in the show? Honestly, yeah. Now, don't get me wrong,
Or you're just seeing tactical nukes in the actual games, because you see this very often in gameplay mechanics where they underpower nuclear weapons. Like in Command & Conquer, a nuclear weapon can't even destroy the construction site because it would be overpowered, because then your opponent couldn't even rebuild anything anymore. So I've seen that for a gameplay mechanic, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, it's not in line with the 200 to 750 kiloton range at all. Those are big.
Creators of the Fallout franchise did consider this back in the day. According to the Vault Dweller's Survival Guide, though the yields of the nuclear bombs were smaller than the biggest bombs we have today, they did release far more nuclear fallout than expected. And what we see here in the show are just 4 of potentially thousands or tens of thousands of bombs that hit the US during the Great War.
Yeah, possibly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of teeny tiny ones. Who knows?
In fact, we know from dialogue in Fallout New Vegas that 77 nukes were launched at Vegas and its surrounding area alone.
So interesting, in this dialogue, it uses the term atomic warhead. So that implies that it's fission-based technology rather than fusion-based, like thermonuclear bombs, the big megaton, multi-megaton nuclear weapons. I'm also appreciating the irony in the weapon in the town of Megaton only being in the kiloton range or less. Is a bit ironic, but that's just a city name. Megaton sounds way cooler than naming a town kiloton or ton. But yeah, the term atomic warhead refers to older pure fission bombs, the ones like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as opposed to, say, hydrogen bombs like the Castle Bravo device, the B-83 1.2 megaton one that was mentioned earlier, and of course the infamous Tsar Bomba that was a ridiculous, impractical 50 megatons. So that kind of checks out that we're dealing with smaller weapons. But given enough smaller weapons, you could conceivably cause the amount of radiological release. They would all have to be surfaced to cause the amount of contamination that you see in the game, and you're not going to see any mutated creatures. But theoretically, with enough of them, that is to say, way more nuclear weapons than we had at the height of the Cold War, which is possible considering the Cold War, they never disarmed any weapons, and you could argue that maybe in the Fallout universe, the production of nuclear weapons rose exponentially all the way up through 2070, rather than declining in the 1990s.
At just that one city. So yeah, things would have been bad even with the smaller nukes. But with all of that being said, ignoring the idea that the bombs in Fallout released more radiation than expected, let me ask you this. In the real world with real nukes, how long do you think society would need to remain in their shelters and vaults before it was safe to come out again? 10 years? 100 years? 200? Never? Well, what if I told you that it could actually be as little as just a few weeks? Yeah.
The vast majority of it goes away within 72 hours in terms of shelter. So they possibly used the Cobalt-60 salted nukes to make the area more radioactive. But even then, the effects of those weapons have been a bit exaggerated, but it would create increased activity that extends beyond the weeks to even years and beyond. So you would have an increased amount of contamination. But yeah, that is one thing I forget, is that the Fallout games take place 200 years later, which doesn't exactly track. Unless there were smaller nuclear wars that happened after the fact and there were continual nuclear wars, but I haven't found that in any of the games that I've played.
Weeks. See, when we think of nuclear disasters, the things that typically come to mind are Chernobyl or Fukushima, where radiation levels can still be problematic decades after the initial incidents.
Now, I've done several videos on both Chernobyl and Fukushima, and it's really not. Now, there are exclusion zones that require the areas to be controlled, but as far as it being problematic, not really. The wildlife has flourished. There have even been a few arguments that Chernobyl created a massive nature preserve just because most humans have left the vicinity, but animal and plant life have flourished within that area. So it's more like decades of control. Now, I'm not talking about the area within the plant directly. I'm talking that area has needed additional reinforcements, structures. There was the new safe confinement structure that was placed over the Chernobyl sarcophagus in 20 years after the accident. A lot of the surrounding area exclusion zones, not really as much of an issue as most people think it is.
Meltdowns like those, radioactive uranium and plutonium are leaked into the local environment.
Wow, they actually showed, so that looks like uranium ore and freshly processed plutonium. You're not going to see anything that looks like that, and you're certainly not going to see any green glowy stuff. Even in Fallout, I don't recall that much green glowy stuff except for a few of the monsters. At least not as much as you would think. That's more of raw materials. You would see would just be bits and pieces of metal because it was all machined into fuel assemblies, which look like this. Very refined, very processed, but mixed in with a bunch of debris can actually be kind of hard to spot, especially when it's been scattered in the case of Chernobyl. But it's pretty easy to spot with Geiger counters by survey teams, which is why a lot of this was able to be cleaned up.
And unfortunately, those elements have high half-lives, the amount of time it takes for just half of the radioactive atoms to dissipate.
So those last a while, but the main hazard with that is an internal dose for both uranium and plutonium. It's mainly stuff like cesium-137, which has a half-life of about 30 years, but is much more radioactive and hazardous to deal with. So that's one big misconception out there, is it's not the reactants, the uranium or the plutonium, it's more of the fission products that are the problematic sources of radiation, either post-nuclear accident or post-nuclear explosion.
It can take tens of thousands or even hundreds of millions of years for those elements to become inert, so
natural uranium's even longer. Takes about 5 billion years. It's not that radioactive compared to cesium-137, strontium-90, iodine-131. That one's particularly nasty because it can get you right in the thyroid and cause thyroid cancer. In fact, when doing off-site dose assessments post-nuclear accident, a lot of it is normalized as dose-equivalent iodine, since that's the radioisotope that's going to cause the most damage, at least immediately. Even all these fission products, since we're talking like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, a lot of it, then the amount of radioactivity goes way down after 200 years.
For us humans, that basically means that there will be dangerous amounts of radiation at those disaster sites forever. But
again, no, that's not really the case, because those aren't your most hazardous sources. And really, uranium and plutonium, just don't eat it and huff it and you'll be fine.
things are different when it comes to a radioactive explosion. When a nuclear bomb goes off, the uranium and plutonium powering the bomb is quickly converted into energy and dozens of other radioactive isotopes.
In principle, the same thing happened in the reactors, just took a very slow, long period of time. So we're actually sort of dealing with the same ingredients, it's just the speed that's different, for the most part. Nuclear bombs have are a lot more plutonium heavy. Though plutonium does exist in a uranium fuel cycle, which a lot of people don't realize, because some of the uranium is converted into plutonium over the course of core life. Because natural uranium is uranium-238, absorbs a neutron, becomes uranium-239, which beta decays into neptunium-239, which beta decays into plutonium-239, which is reactive and is effectively a secondary source of fuel. And using some of your fuel, you're making some of your fuel. In fact, there are entire reactors that are designed with that purpose in mind, called breeder reactors, that actually make more fuel than they use, at least in their first cycle.
Thankfully, most of these isotopes have relatively tiny half-lives, with radiation levels falling off more than 50% after just 1 hour and 99% after just 48. Basically,
and that's the reason why a lot of it goes down, why you want to shelter in place for at least 72 hours, just to be conservative, because that 48 hours, things go away, and then you add the additional 24 on top of it, just to be conservative. There's a lot of math done like that in nuclear engineering, where you give yourself additional margin just to be sure.
For every 7-fold increase in time, there's a 10-fold decrease in radioactivity. After about a few weeks, radiation levels are likely as low as they're gonna be for a long time, and should be safe enough for humanity to emerge from their vaults to either flee or rebuild. Don't believe me? Well, we can look at real-world examples like Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So the rule of thumb is 7 or 10 half-lives, then you say it's gone. Kind of depends on how conservative you want to be. But most health physicists, radiation protection experts tend to say 7 to 10 half-lives and it's gone. Even though it's not really gone, but it's effectively part of background.
Those cities were being rebuilt just a few months after the bombs fell, and today radiation levels in both are basically no higher than they are anywhere else in the world. And if you want an example that's a bit closer to home,
So part of The reason why Hiroshima and Nagasaki is because they were airbursts and a lot of the fallout was blown away. Not to mention radiation, while devastating, horrific way to go, radiation sickness. It could have done more damage if it contaminated more of the surface. But even still, a lot of those effects have been greatly exaggerated. So it's interesting to see that this video is pointing that out.
You could spend an entire year at the ground zero of Oppenheimer's Trinity test and be exposed to entirely normal and safe levels of radiation. Now, do not misunderstand me. Any amount of nuclear conflict is not good. These explosions suck for humanity, for civilization, for anyone and anything. And even if the amount of radioactive fallout were a fraction of the devastation we see in the games and the show, that would cause irreversible damage to the Earth and our fellow human beings. And remember, according to Fallout,
and as far as irreversible damage, I always took that to mean what you see in the Fallout games. They just had a whole bunch of smaller nukes, like way more than we ever had during the Cold War. And, well, it's technically not irreversible, but if they set off so many of those, then yeah, it can cause the kind of damage you see in the game. Though the 200 years has always been a bit perplexing to me. I remember when I first played the game, and this was long before being fully qualified as a nuclear engineer, that it didn't quite seem right to me. That the 200-year gap didn't seem to make any sense. You don't need to be an expert to question that.
Or the bombs released more radiation than expected. But still, the big takeaway here, if the bombs were as big as what we can see with our own eyes here in this series, here in this scene from the show, it wouldn't be as bad as the Fallout franchise wants us to believe. But that's not to say that it wouldn't still be the end of civilization as we know it, both in the real world and in Fallout. Yeah, one last twist of the nuclear knife here, but even if the explosions and resulting radiation wouldn't destroy the world, the long-term effects of the bombs still totally could. See, along with the sheer destructive power of the nuclear explosions, the energy of the bombs would likely cause many large fires. This, in turn, would result in a lot of smoke, and with thousands of fires across the entire United States.
Oh, are they seriously going for the triidal nuclear winter argument?
If not the entire world, billions of pounds of soot and ash are going to be released into the atmosphere. See, the sun would only need to be blocked just like a teeny tiny little bit to lower the average temperature of the world by a few degrees Celsius, enough to have an irreversible effect on our climate. So, unlike what we see here in Fallout with a hot nuclear desert wasteland, it's far more likely that the planet would enter a nuclear winter.
Okay, a few things here. So I've talked about nuclear winter more in a different video. I'll pin that one down in the comments below if you want to see the full thing. I got a few issues with this. So first, the models used to predict the effects of nuclear winter have a lot of uncertainties. The amount of smoke generated, how long it stays up in the atmosphere. There are some that it stays up for decades, whereas there's some that say it'll just stay up for days to weeks. There have been instances of volcanic eruptions that had such a large amount of soot that didn't really have a noticeable impact, and some that had more, but some of that has been exaggerated. As well as the firestorms. I mean, we've seen large-scale firestorms in Australia. There was the Kuwaiti oil fires during the Gulf War that were massive, but didn't cause the level of smoke and soot released into the upper atmosphere. And it's likely to have more effects on certain regions that are more susceptible to winter, and obviously the winter damaging to fragile, dynamic climates. A big one is not taking into the effects of atmospheric circulation in the upper atmosphere and how high the soot goes, and how some particles will just fall back down and some will hang up there. And you don't just see this with nuclear war. I've seen it with asteroid impact sort of things. Now, granted, the asteroid impacts are probably more likely if you're talking like massive asteroids, such as the one that killed the dinosaurs. Now, it's possible within the Fallout universe, I don't know if they have expanded like a massive amount of cities, that those firestorms are more likely in that universe. I don't actually know. From playing the games, you just see wastelands mostly, so still probably not. But I don't want to downplay it too much. but it's not an on and off switch like a lot of people believe it is. It would have some effects, but a lot of it has been exaggerated. Again, details in the other video. I just thought I would point that out.
This in turn would devastate many of the crops that we're able to grow, with some models of nuclear war projecting that some 80% of the world population would die of starvation. Something very similar actually happened in the real world in the year 1816, known as the Year Without a Summer. See, in 1815...
80% of the population did not die in 1816. What?
Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted and released particulates into the atmosphere that blocked enough sunlight from reaching Earth to temporarily lower the temperature by a couple of degrees. Because of this, for much of the world, summer did not come the next year.
Hey, maybe that's one way to counter the +2 degrees from global climate change. I'm not seriously suggesting that. It's just been overblown. Not that I'm wanting to stress test this. We don't want to try to see what nuclear winter actually does. Commence a live experiment here. No, it's an exaggeration. Though I will say nuclear winter is more realistic than the Fallout universe with all the monsters that were created by mutations and the magical forced evolutionary virus that they put in to create a bunch of super mutants. So I'll give the nuclear winter theory that. I would say it's more realistic than that, because there are at least some realistic effects from it. I wouldn't read too much into it.
Crops failed across Europe and the United States, with millions struggling to find food, all from just one volcano.
So the Tambora eruption, you can argue, actually disproves some of this nuclear winter stuff. They say just one eruption. The Tambora eruption was 30,000 megatons. Makes nukes look tiny by comparison. And it didn't wipe out 80% of the population. As of now, in 2024, there are less than 4,000 active nuclear weapons and about 12,000 total. And they're less than 1 megaton apiece. So it's not going to do that much damage. It's going to be less than, as far as the nuclear winter effects are concerned. The damage are going to be whatever those nukes happen to hit. Now, switching back to the Fallout universe, they might have had 30,000 megatons, maybe 300,000, maybe even 3 million megatons being spread across in many, many millions of small devices all going off at once. Now, that would cause more damage. It's interesting you list the Tambora example, because that's another argument. I would say that's another argument against the worst case scenarios for nuclear winter.
Multiply that by the atomic fire of thousands or even tens of thousands of nuclear bombs.
No, nuclear bombs are small compared to Tambora, dude. You got it backwards. You're dividing.
This right here, that's a major part of why nuclear war is such an existential threat. Yes, the initial explosions might kill unfathomable numbers of people, and the radiation would have long-term dangerous side effects. But that's assuming we even get that far.
Not to mention, those effects are more immediate. Okay, man, this guy actually had me going. I liked his doing both sides of the ways of analyzing sci-fi, but until he mentioned the nuclear winter stuff, he was doing good, but no. Volcanic eruptions are one of the main arguments against it.
Fallout series has never been one to sugarcoat how awful such an apocalypse would be. Obviously, this is a world I would not want to live in. But what we see in this show and in the games, a world that has recovered enough to have cities and settlements like Shady Sands in Philly, Diamond City and Megaton, even that might be too optimistic an outlook. But hey, that's just a theory. A film theory!
And right after that, with the classic misuse of the word theory as their stinger. I wanted to like this, but I don't want anyone to think that I'm pro-nuclear war or even nuclear weapons at all. I'm all for the peaceful use of nuclear power as safe, clean, reliable energy source. This exaggerated effect of nuclear winter and somehow making that connection with nuclear power, which they didn't do in this video, but I've heard similar arguments linking the two, continues to give nuclear technology a bad name. But maybe I'm looking too much into this. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.